She was rejected by every man for being black, until one farmer changed everything. A woman steps off a train in a valley she's never seen, clutching 8 months of love letters, only to watch her promised husband look at her face and recoil, not because she isn't beautiful, but because her skin tells him she isn't worthy. Sarah Brown came to Pinewood Valley searching for escape from Chicago's suffocating segregation and broken promises. She wore her mother's carefully mended traveling dress and carried her father's pocket watch, believing Thomas Clark's letters about partnership, respect, and building something honest together. Instead, she found a dirt platform, a bouquet of wildflowers thrown in the dust, and a man whose hatred ran deeper than his words. But she also found James Smith, a wealthy farmer holding an axe and a quiet sense of justice, who would help her uncover not just a stolen inheritance, but the power to transform an entire community built on lies. James Smith didn't ask questions. He lifted Sarah's suitcase as though it weighed nothing and set it in the back of his wagon with the same care he might show a crate of eggs. Sarah climbed up beside him, her legs still unsteady from 3 weeks of train travel and the shock of Thomas Clark's rejection. James clicked his tongue and the horses moved forward, leaving the station and its small crowd of gawkers behind. Sarah studied him from the corner of her eye. His shirt was expensive linen but worn soft from labor, tucked into work pants that had seen 1,000 days in the fields. His hands on the reins were broad and calloused, but his nails were clean. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd chosen solitude rather than had it forced upon him, strong-featured, dark-haired, with lines around his eyes from squinting at sun rather than from smiling. He couldn't have been more than 30, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone much older. They rode in silence for 20 minutes, the wagon wheels creaking over dirt roads that wound between golden fields and stands of oak trees. When they crested a small hill, Sarah's breath caught. Below them spread a farmstead that looked like something from a painting, orchards heavy with apples, neat rows of vegetable gardens, livestock barns with fresh paint, and at the center, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and glass windows that caught the afternoon light. This wasn't a homesteader's patch of hard-won land. This was wealth, old and established. James pulled the wagon to a stop near a small cottage set apart from the main house. It had a stone chimney, mullioned windows, and a view across the apple orchards toward the mountains. "You can stay here," he said, his first word since leaving the station. "It's clean. There's firewood." Sarah found her voice. "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." He lifted her suitcase down and set it by the cottage door. "I need help with the account books. Harvest crew respects numbers more than they respect me. You can work for room and board if you want. If you don't, you can leave when you're ready. Your choice." He walked back to the wagon, then paused. "There's bread and cheese in the pantry. Mrs. Chen will bring supper around 6. He climbed up, gathered the reins, and drove toward the main house without looking back. Sarah stood alone in front of the cottage, the September sun warm on her shoulders. Through the window she could see a simple room with a bed, a table, a fireplace already laid with kindling. It was more dignity than she'd been shown in years. That night, after Mrs. Chen, a quiet Chinese woman with knowing eyes, had brought soup and fresh bread, Sarah unpacked her suitcase by lamplight. She set her mother's quilt on the bed and her father's pocket watch on the table. Then she opened the leather document folder she'd carried since his death 3 years ago. Inside were papers she'd studied 100 times without fully understanding, surveyors' maps with elevation marks and creek notations, legal claims written in fountain pen, and at the bottom of one yellowed page, her father's name in bold letters, Marcus Brown, primary claimant, water appropriation patent, January 15, 1889. She'd always known her father had worked as a surveyor out west before she was born. She'd never understood why he'd come back to Chicago angry and broken, why he'd refused to speak of it, why he'd made her promise on his deathbed to find out what they stole. Now, sitting in a cottage on a stranger's land in a valley that had just rejected her, Sarah smoothed the papers flat and studied them with new purpose. Her father had been here. In this valley. And something had driven him away. She looked out the window at James Smith's orchards, at the neat rows of trees and the distant glint of water in the creek beds, and felt the first stirring of something she hadn't expected to feel again after this afternoon's humiliation, curiosity. And beneath it, a quiet, burning need to understand why her father's last words had been, "They took everything, Sarah. Don't let them forget." Sarah woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of wood smoke. By the time she dressed and stepped outside, the sun was just cresting the mountains, painting the orchards gold. Mrs. Chen was already at the main house, hanging laundry on a line that stretched between two oak trees. She nodded to Sarah without speaking, but her eyes were kind. The first week passed in a rhythm Sarah hadn't known she was hungry for. She rose at dawn, helped Mrs. Chen with breakfast for the harvest crew, then spent her mornings in James's estate office, a cluttered room in the farmhouse filled with ledgers, contracts, and receipts that hadn't been properly organized in what looked like a decade. James appeared occasionally, asking brief questions about payroll or supply orders, then vanished back into the fields. He never lingered, never made conversation beyond what was necessary, but Sarah noticed things. The way he paid his workers fairly, even generously. The way he spoke to Mrs. Chen with the same respect he'd show any employee, despite the ugly whispers about Chinese immigrants that Sarah had heard at the general store. Because she'd ventured into town with Mrs. Chen on the third day, and learned exactly how Pinewood Valley felt about James Smith. The other farmers fell silent when he entered the feed store, their faces tight with resentment. Women in the general store stopped their conversations mid-sentence when Sarah and Mrs. Chen approached the counter. The shopkeeper had taken their money but slid their purchases across the counter without meeting their eyes, as though proximity might contaminate him. On the seventh evening, as Sarah was closing the ledgers, James appeared in the office doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He set one on her desk without asking, then leaned against the window frame, looking out at his land. "You're wondering why they hate me," he said. Sarah didn't deny it. "I've seen enough hate to recognize it. My grandfather made his fortune in railroads and California gold. Bought this land in 1892 when nobody wanted it, said it was too far from water, too hard to work. He proved them wrong." James's voice was matter-of-fact, without pride or apology. "The other farmers here, their families homesteaded. Broke their backs clearing stones, lost children to fever, barely survived the first winters. They think I didn't earn what I have." He paused, his jaw tight. "They're not entirely wrong. But I'm trying to do something different with it." "What's that?" Sarah asked. He looked at her directly for the first time since that day at the station. "Make it mean something besides money." Then he left, taking his coffee with him, leaving Sarah alone with her questions and the growing certainty that James Smith was the most complicated man she'd ever met, neither saint nor villain, but something harder to categorize. Something rare. 3 weeks into her work, Sarah found the map. She was cataloging property documents in the estate office, creating a proper filing system from decades of chaos, when a folded surveyor's map slipped from between 2 deed books. It was dated 1891 and showed water flow patterns across the entire valley, every creek, every spring, every irrigation channel that fed the farm spread across Pinewood Valley. Sarah traced the lines with her finger. Every single water source originated on James's property, fed by a network of springs high in the eastern hills. But the water rights themselves were mysteriously undefined, marked with a question mark in the notation, "See primary claim, 1889. Sarah's hands went still. She pulled her father's document folder from her satchel and spread his papers beside the map. There it was, Marcus Brown, primary claimant, water appropriation patent, January 15, 1889. 3 years before the surveyor's map. 3 years before most of the founding families had even arrived in the territory. Her father had been here first. Had claimed the water that made this entire valley viable. And somehow, impossibly, that claim had vanished. She found James in the north orchard, pruning apple trees with methodical precision. "We need to talk," she said, and her voice must have carried something urgent because he set down his shears immediately. In the office, she showed him the documents side by side. James studied them in silence, then said quietly, "I wondered when you'd find it." "You knew." "It wasn't a question. Your father worked for my grandfather as a surveyor. He discovered the springs in 1889, filed the legal claim, then was run out of the territory before he could exercise his rights." James met her eyes. "My grandfather bought the land at auction after your father abandoned it." "But I don't think it was an abandonment, Sarah. I think it was theft. They came on a Tuesday morning, 4 men on horseback kicking up dust as they rode hard toward James's farmhouse. Sarah saw them from the office window and recognized Thomas Clark at the front, his face red with rage even from a distance. Beside him rode 3 other members of the Pinewood Valley Farmers Association, hard men with the weathered faces of those who'd fought the land for every acre and resented anyone who hadn't. James met them at the porch, and Sarah watched through the window as Thomas dismounted and jabbed a finger toward the guest cottage. "You're harboring a woman of loose character," Thomas announced, loud enough for the harvest crew working the near orchard to hear. "It's a disgrace to the community. She needs to leave." But Sarah could see past the bluster to the real fear underneath. If word spread that a black woman was working as James Smith's bookkeeper, managing a wealthy white man's accounts, Thomas's rejection of her at the station would transform from righteous into foolish. His pride couldn't survive that transformation. James stood unmoving in his doorway, arms crossed. "Miss Brown is my employee. She has a contract. If you have legal objections, bring them to the county clerk." "A contract?" Thomas spat. "With a careful." James's voice went cold. "Very careful." The confrontation might have escalated into violence if Sarah hadn't stepped outside. The men's heads whipped toward her, and she felt the weight of their hatred like a physical force. But she'd survived worse than hate. She'd survived Chicago's invisible walls, survived being told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, human enough. She met Thomas's gaze directly and said simply, "I'm not leaving. I have as much right to be here as anyone." Thomas's face went purple. "You have no rights here. This is a decent community, and we won't be." "That's enough," the man beside Thomas said. He was older, with iron-gray hair and the calculating eyes of someone who thought in longer terms. "We've made our position clear, Smith. The association expects you to act appropriately." They rode away trailing dust and threats, but Sarah felt no relief. James stood beside her on the porch, watching them disappear down the valley road. "They'll come back," he said quietly. "The association controls the county commissioner, the sheriff, the bank. If they decide you're a threat, they'll find a way to force the issue. Let them try." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I'm tired of running." James looked at her with something like respect. "Then we'd better be ready for what comes next." Dorothy Chen arrived 3 days later in a hired carriage from San Francisco, and Sarah understood immediately why Mrs. Chen's eyes had always held such quiet pride. Dorothy was perhaps 30, dressed in a severe black suit that would have looked at home in any courthouse, carrying a leather case that marked her as professional despite the impossibility of her existence, a Chinese-American woman who'd somehow passed the California bar when most universities wouldn't even admit her. James had sent for her without telling Sarah, and now the 3 of them sat in the farmhouse parlor while Dorothy examined Sarah's documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that one mistake could cost everything. She read every page twice, checked dates against a timeline she'd drawn in a notebook, then finally set down her pencil and looked at Sarah. "This is legitimate," Dorothy said. "Your father held primary water appropriation rights under territorial law. When the territory became a state in 1890, those rights should have been grandfathered in automatically. Instead, they were fraudulently transferred to something called the Pinewood Valley Agricultural Collective, which didn't legally exist in 1891. "Can we prove that?" Sarah asked. "I already have. I stopped at the county clerk's office on my way here. The collective wasn't registered until 1893, 2 years after they supposedly purchased your father's rights. Dorothy's smile was thin and sharp. Someone forged the transfer documents and backdated them. It's not even a sophisticated forgery, they used the wrong legal language for territorial claims. Sarah felt something fierce and bright kindle in her chest. So we can sue them. We can. But a lawsuit would take years and might fail in a hostile local court with an all-white jury. You'd spend every penny you have and might end up with nothing. Dorothy paused. There's another option. Direct confrontation using the threat of legal action. If you can prove they knowingly used forged documents, you can demand a settlement. But you'll need leverage, something they value more than their pride. Sarah thought of the map, of the springs that fed every farm in the valley, of the way the creeks had looked 3 days ago when she'd walked them with James, lower than they should be, leaving dust lines on the banks. Water, she said. They need water. Dorothy's eyes gleamed. And according to these documents, you own it. Every drop that flows through this valley. James leaned forward. It's going to be a dry year. The old-timers are already talking about drought. By July, water won't just be valuable, it'll mean survival. Then we wait, Dorothy said. Let them feel the squeeze. Let them understand what's at stake. And when they're desperate enough, we make our move. She looked at Sarah with something like admiration. Your father couldn't fight them because he was alone and the law didn't protect him. But you're not alone. And the law, when it's properly applied, is on your side. Sarah touched her father's pocket watch, feeling its familiar weight. Then we'll use it. Not for revenge. For justice. Justice, Dorothy agreed. And maybe something better than that. Maybe transformation. By July, the drought was undeniable. Sarah watched from the farmhouse porch as the creeks that fed the valley shrank to trickles, leaving cracked mud and dying grass in their wake. James's spring still flowed strong, he'd built cisterns and irrigation systems that captured every drop, but beyond his property line, the other farms were suffering. Corn withered in the fields. Cattle clustered around shrinking water holes. And the Farmers Association called an emergency meeting to discuss rationing. The summons arrived for James on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a boy on a tired horse. They need you there, the boy said, not meeting James's eyes. Your land has the springs. They want to work out a rationing schedule. Sarah was standing beside James when he read the notice. I'm coming with you, she said. Sarah. If I'm going to claim my father's rights, they need to see my face. They need to understand this isn't abstract. She met his eyes. I'm done hiding. The town hall was a sweltering room packed with sunburned farmers and their anxious wives, and when Sarah entered beside James, the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Conversations died mid-sentence. Thomas Clark half rose from his seat, his face going red, but County Commissioner Stewart, the gray-haired man who'd accompanied Thomas to James's farm, gestured sharply for silence. We're here about water, not social customs, Stewart said, his voice carrying the weight of pragmatic authority. Sit down, Clark. The association's proposal was brutal in its calculation, a rationing schedule that would ensure the established farms, Thomas Clark's, the Henderson Place, the Morrison Ranch, received enough water to survive, while smaller operations would be left to fail. It was survival of the powerful dressed up as fairness, and it made Sarah's stomach turn. James stood, and every eye in the room fixed on him. I won't sign this, he said quietly. Then he gestured to Sarah. Miss Brown has something to say. The room exploded. Men shouted, women gasped, and Thomas Clark was on his feet roaring about propriety and decency and how dare James allow a Negro woman to speak in their meeting. But Commissioner Stewart's gavel cracked like a gunshot, and in the sudden silence, Sarah's voice rang clear. I'm Marcus Brown's daughter, she said. And I own the water you're trying to ration. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could hear the creak of floorboards as people shifted, the rustle of papers, the rapid breathing of men who just realized their world had tilted on its axis. She opened her document folder and held up the 1889 patent for everyone to see. My father filed the primary water appropriation claim for every spring in this valley 3 years before most of you arrived. That claim was stolen through forged documents. And now I'm here to take it back. Thomas Clark's voice was strangled. This is insane. You can't. I can, Sarah said. And I will. Unless you're ready to talk about justice. Dorothy Chen stood beside Sarah at the front of the town hall, and one by one she laid out the evidence like a prosecutor presenting a murder case. The original 1889 patent with the territorial governor's seal, still bright and unforged. Marcus Brown's surveyor notebooks, filled with elevation marks and spring locations that matched the valley's geography exactly. A bill of sale showing that the Farmers Association had purchased their water rights in 1891 from a man named Carson Hayes. Dorothy demonstrated with clerk's records, had never owned any water rights at all. The Pinewood Valley Agricultural Collective, Dorothy said, her voice precise and unforgiving, didn't exist in 1891. It wasn't registered until 1893. Someone created it retroactively, forged a transfer document, and backdated it to cover up theft. The room was silent except for rustling paper and creaking floorboards. Sarah watched the men's faces transform as they understood, their entire lives were built on a lie, and the proof was irrefutable. Thomas Clark tried to bluster. This is a forgery. A con game. She probably created these documents herself. But Commissioner Stewart held up a hand, his face gray. He examined the patent, checked the governor's seal against the embossing tools described in the territorial registry, then set it down carefully as though it might explode. These look legitimate, Clark. If they are, we have a serious problem. He turned to Sarah, and she saw something like fear in his eyes. What do you want, Miss Brown? Reparations? Are you going to shut off the water until we pay? Every person in the room was thinking the same thing, this black woman could destroy them all. She could cut off the water, watch their farms die, bankrupt the valley. She had every legal right to vengeance, and no one could stop her. Sarah let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then she spoke with careful precision. I want justice, not revenge. My father was driven out of this valley because of hatred. I won't perpetuate that cycle. But I also won't pretend the theft didn't happen. She looked at Thomas Clark, at the men who'd stood with him at the station, at the women who'd whispered about her in the general store. This valley was built on a lie. We're going to transform it into something honest. Or you can refuse, and I'll exercise my legal rights to every drop of water that flows through your land. Your choice. The room erupted. Some men shouted, some looked calculating, and Thomas Clark looked like he might have a stroke. But Commissioner Stewart gavelled for silence again, and when he spoke, his voice was weary. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Brown? Sarah told them. The negotiation lasted 3 weeks and felt like warfare. Sarah's proposal was straightforward. The Farmers Association would pay a percentage of their annual profits into a trust, the Brown Agricultural Trust, designed to provide loans, education, and land ownership opportunities to black farmers and other marginalized groups across 3 counties. In exchange, Sarah would guarantee water access in perpetuity under a clearly defined legal framework. She would deed the water rights to the trust, which would manage them fairly for everyone. Some farmers, led by Thomas Clark, threatened violence. They appeared at James's farm with shotguns, shouting about how they wouldn't be dictated to by a Negro. James met them with his own rifle and the calm statement that if they wanted war, he'd give them one, and his money could hire more guns than theirs. They left, but the threats continued. Sarah found hateful letters nailed to the cottage door. Someone poisoned 3 of James's cattle. Mrs. Chen's laundry was stolen from the line and returned shredded. But other farmers, exhausted by drought and aware of their legal vulnerability, saw Sarah's offer as merciful. They whispered in church that maybe this was God's judgment, that maybe they needed to accept terms. A delegation of women, led by Thomas Clark's own sister, Martha, appeared at James's door and asked to speak with Sarah privately. In the cottage, Martha said quietly, "What happened to your father was wrong. We all knew it was wrong, but we were too afraid to say it. Give us a chance to make it right." Commissioner Stewart threw his weight behind the settlement when Dorothy Chin showed him legal precedent from 3 other Western territories where water rights cases had bankrupted entire counties. "If this goes to federal court," Dorothy said, "Miss Brown will win, and she'll be entitled to damages that will exceed the total value of every farm in Pinewood Valley. Take the settlement." After 3 weeks, the agreement was signed in the county clerk's office with Dorothy Chin as witness. The Brown Agricultural Trust would receive 5% of agricultural profits for 20 years. Sarah would deed the water rights to the trust with the guarantee that no farmer, regardless of race, would be denied access without cause. The trust would purchase the Clark farm at auction. Thomas had already listed it for sale, his face twisted with humiliation, and subdivided into 10-acre plots for black farming families. Thomas Clark left Pinewood Valley the day after the signing, and 3 other families followed. But most stayed, entering an uneasy partnership with the woman they tried to reject. Sarah stood in the clerk's office holding the signed agreement and felt her father's watch ticking against her palm like a second heartbeat. Justice, she thought. Not revenge. Transformation. That night, James found her on the cottage porch, watching the sun set over the orchards. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her in comfortable silence. After a long moment, Sarah said, "Thank you. For everything. You did this," James said. "I just gave you space to do it. You gave me more than space." Sarah looked at him, this complicated, principled man who'd chosen to use his power for justice instead of comfort. "You gave me partnership." James met her eyes, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with water rights or legal battles. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "Partnership?" Sarah thought about Chicago, about running, about all the ways she tried to escape instead of standing and fighting. She thought about her father's stolen legacy and the valley she transformed. "Yes," she said. "I want to build something honest here. With you." James smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Then let's build it." 6 months later, Pinewood Valley looked different. The Brown Agricultural Trust had purchased the Clark farm and subdivided it into 10-acre plots, and 5 black families from Mississippi and Alabama had already arrived to work the land. The valley's first integrated school opened in the old association hall, funded by the trust and taught by a young black woman from Oakland who believed education was revolution. And at James Smith's farm, Sarah Brown, now Sarah Smith, after a quiet wedding ceremony that Dorothy Chin had officiated and Mrs. Chin had catered, stood beside her husband at the valley's first integrated harvest festival. Tables stretched between the apple trees, laden with food that black and white families had prepared together. Children chased each other through the orchards, too young to carry their parents' prejudices. The trust's first loan recipient stood in a group near the main barn, discussing irrigation techniques and seed varieties with farmers who 6 months ago wouldn't have spoken to them. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't vanish in a season. Sarah saw the way some families still kept their distance, heard the whispers that followed her in town. But something fundamental had shifted. The valley was no longer built on theft. It was being rebuilt on acknowledgement, restitution, and the possibility of something better. Commissioner Stewart approached Sarah with a glass of cider and an awkward nod. "The trust's first report came to my office yesterday. Loan applications from 14 families, all approved. You're changing this place." "We're changing it," Sarah corrected. "All of us. Or trying to." That evening, after the festival had wound down and the last guests had departed, Sarah and James walked through the orchards her father had surveyed 50 years ago. The irrigation channels flowed clear and steady, feeding trees that bore fruit for everyone. In the farmhouse library, Sarah had created a memorial, her father's pocket watch in a shadow box beside the original 1889 water patent. Below it, a small brass placard read, Marcus Brown, 1852–1893. The water remembers. Sarah touched the glass, feeling the weight of what she'd accomplished. Her father had been driven out in hatred. She'd returned and transformed that hatred into something redemptive. Not because she was saintly or forgiving, but because revenge would have destroyed her as surely as it would have destroyed the valley. "What are you thinking?" James asked. Sarah looked out at the land, at the new farms taking shape on what had been Clark's property, at the lights flickering in the trust's office where Dorothy Chen was working late on loan applications. "I'm thinking I became something I didn't expect. Not a victim. Not an avenger. Something else." "What's that?" "A founder," Sarah said. "Someone who builds instead of destroys. Someone who remembers the theft but doesn't let it define the future." She smiled. "My father would have liked that." James took her hand, and together they walked back to the farmhouse, to the life they were building, to the valley they were transforming, to the legacy that would bear both their names. Sarah Brown had been rejected by every man for the color of her skin. But she'd become the woman who saved them all, who took theft and turned it into restoration, who transformed a valley built on lies into a community built on acknowledgement and hope. The water remembered. And now, so would everyone else.